Okay, so this is week six, lecture 5. We're going to be talking about false memories. So I want to start out by talking about flashbulb memories. There's a ton of fascinating literature in this field, and flashbulb memories are emotional memories that are extremely vivid and detailed. Now, in 1977, Roger Brown and James Kulik introduced the term flashbulb memories to help explain why we have these crazy, vivid, detailed accounts of emotional events. They argue that important traumatic events are stored in a complete and vivid way that captures the context, the event, and the emotional reaction to it. So the idea being that when something very dangerous or emotional happens, there may not be time in the moment to analyze exactly what happened. But by storing a vivid memory of the situation, we can re-examine it later and learn from it to avoid potentially dangerous situations that might occur again in the future. Since then, psychologists have wondered about the accuracy of these memories. Brown and Kulik looked at the characteristics of memories for past events. So they looked in detail at the assassination of Martin Luther King, but also gathered data about other assassination attempts and personal unexpected shocks from the past. What they found is that people are highly confident in these flashbulb memories. They feel as if all the details have been preserved and done so accurately. However, research suggests that this confidence is misleading. Another group of researchers tried to test this idea by sending out surveys immediately after the airplane attacks on 9/11, 2001. They sent out follow-up surveys to participants after 1, 3, and 10 years. All survey participants had flashbulb memories and were generally highly confident in their memories. But when the details of their memories were compared to the initial survey taken within 10 days of the event happening, there were significant inconsistencies. A year after 9/11, only about 2/3 of what people remembered was accurate. Now, they were reasonably accurate regarding core events like the number of planes involved and the location of the crash sites. But memories for more peripheral facts, such as where President Bush was at the time and the airlines of the planes, were remembered far less well. So this suggests that there's not only differences in the memories, but the types of memories. Another interesting point is that if someone added an incorrect detail into their memory for the event, that information was likely to be repeated in later accounts rather than corrected. So this suggests that one reason why flashbulb memories remain so vivid for people is that they're recalled over time. Extra information that emerges when someone recalls a memory can get incorporated into that memory later. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes when we get to Elizabeth Loftus's work. Another type of false memory is source monitoring confusion. This involves the ability to identify the origins of a memory. So for example, if you're trying to remember a distinct conversation with a friend, sometimes you might get confused about whether you actually said something or just thought about saying it. According to this view of memory, we try to identify the origins of our memory by looking for cues about how we encoded them. And in many cases, source monitoring works perfectly well and helps us avoid confusing our memories with our fantasies. But in some cases, we can be fooled. Ever do that thing where you can't remember if you actually sent a text or just thought about sending it? I do that all the time. I'll compose a message or a conversation in my head in such detail that I think I actually sent it. Another type of false memory is cryptomnesia, or the failure to recognize that our ideas originated with someone else. So one really popular example here is that of George Harrison from the Beatles, using cryptomnesia as a defense for copyright laws, in which he used a melody from a different song. Some cases of plagiarism might also fall into the category of cryptomnesia. Adding to the extensive evidence suggesting that we can't really trust our own memories is the work of Elizabeth Loftus, who's conducted a great deal of research showing that false memories can be implanted into people's minds. In 1974, she and her colleague John Palmer showed participants brief clips of a traffic accident, then asked them to estimate the speed vehicles were traveling at the time of the accident. Then they varied the wording of the question. So they said, about how fast were the cars going when they blank into each other? Some people heard the word smashed, others heard hit or bumped or collided. When the word smash was used, people estimated that the cars were going much faster compared to when other words were used. In another study, they called the participants back later and asked them if they recalled seeing any broken glass at the scene of the accident. People who heard the word smashed recalled seeing more broken glass than those in conditions with other words. And this is related to the misinformation effect, which is the creation of fictitious memories by providing misleading information about an event after it takes place. Then there's the Lost in the Mall study, where Loftus had a sample of kids whose relatives would give them a few life situations that actually happened to the kids. Then she would ask the kids to tell her about a time they got lost in the mall. The children thought that their relatives must have told the research team about it, so they figured, well, it must have happened. And the kids would start to report these crazy detailed stories about getting lost in the mall, with all sorts of very vivid detail. What store they finally found their parents in, how scared they felt, if they looked for a police officer. But the event never happened. So these studies show us that suggestive memory procedures can impact our recollections and our behaviors. I want to show you this TED Talk by Elizabeth Loftus that really does a good job of covering some of her work. It's a little long, so bear with me, but it's really interesting and very important in discussing memory.
I'd like to tell you about a legal case that I worked on involving a man named Steve Titus. Titus was a restaurant manager. He was 31 years old. He lived in Seattle, Washington. He was engaged to Gretchen, about to be married. She was the love of his life. And one night, the couple went out for a romantic restaurant meal. They were on their way home, and they were pulled over by a police officer. You see, Titus's car sort of resembled a car that was driven earlier in the evening by a man who raped a female hitchhiker. And Titus kind of resembled that rapist. So the police took a picture of Titus. They put it in a photo lineup. They later showed it to the victim, and she pointed to Titus's photo. She said, "That one's the closest." The police and the prosecution proceeded with a trial. And when Steve Titus was put on trial for rape, the rape victim got on the stand and said, "I'm absolutely positive that's the man." And Titus was convicted. He proclaimed his innocence. His family screamed at the jury. His fiancée collapsed on the floor sobbing, and Titus is taken away to jail. So what would you do at this point? What would you do? Well, Titus lost complete faith in the legal system. And yet he got an idea. He called up the local newspaper. He got the interest of an investigative journalist. And that journalist actually found the real rapist, a man who ultimately confessed to this rape, a man who was thought to have committed 50 rapes in that area. And when this information was given to the judge set Titus free. And really, that's where this case should have ended. It should have been over. Titus should have thought of this as a horrible year, a year of accusation and trial, but over. It didn't end that way. Titus was so bitter. He'd lost his job. He couldn't get it back. He lost his fiancée. She couldn't put up with his persistent anger. He lost his entire savings. And so he decided to file a lawsuit against the police and others whom he felt were responsible for his suffering. And that's when I really started working on this case, trying to figure out how did that victim go from that one's the closest to I'm absolutely positive that's the guy. Well, Titus was consumed with his civil case as he spent every waking moment thinking about it. And just days before he was to have his day in court, he woke up in the morning, doubled over in pain, and died of a stress-related heart attack. He was 35 years old. So I was asked to work on Titus's case because I'm a psychological scientist. I study memory. I've studied memory for decades. And if I meet somebody on an airplane, this happened on the way over to Scotland. If I meet somebody on an airplane and we ask each other, what do you do? What do you do? And I say, I study memory. They usually want to tell me how they have trouble remembering names, or they've got a relative who's got Alzheimer's or some kind of memory problem. But I have to tell them, I don't study when people forget. I study the opposite, when they remember things that didn't happen or remember things that were different from the way they really were. I study false memories. Unhappily, Steve Titus is not the only person to be convicted based on somebody's false memory. In one project in the United States, information has been gathered on 300 innocent people, 300 defendants who were convicted of crimes they didn't do. They spent 10, 20, 30 years in prison for these crimes, and now DNA testing has proven that they're actually innocent. And when those cases have been analyzed, 3/4 of them are due to faulty memory, faulty eyewitness memory. Well, why? Like the jurors who convicted those innocent people and the jurors who convicted Titus, many people believe that memory works like a recording device. You just record the information, then you call it up and play it back when you want to answer questions or identify images. But decades of work in psychology has shown that this just isn't true. Our memories are constructive. They're reconstructive. Memory works a little bit more like a Wikipedia page. You can go in there and change it, but so can other people. I first started studying this constructive memory process in the 1970s. I did my experiments that involved showing people simulated crimes and accidents and asking them questions about what they remember. In one study, we showed people a simulated accident, and we asked people how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. And we asked other people how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And if we asked the leading smash question, the witnesses told us the cars were going faster. And moreover, that leading smash question caused people to be more likely to tell us that they saw broken glass in the accident scene when there wasn't any broken glass at all. In another study, we showed a simulated accident where a car went through an intersection with a stop sign. And if we asked a question that insinuated it was a yield sign, many witnesses told us they remember seeing a yield sign at the intersection, not a stop sign. And you might be thinking, well, these are filmed events. They're not particularly stressful. Would the same kind of mistakes be made with a really stressful event? In a study we published just a few months ago, we have an answer to this question. Because what was unusual about this study is we arranged for people to have a very stressful experience. The subjects in this study were members of the US military who were undergoing a harrowing training exercise to teach them what it's going to be like for them if they are ever captured as prisoners of war. And as part of this training exercise, these soldiers are interrogated in an aggressive, hostile, physically abusive fashion for 30 minutes. And later on, they have to try to identify the person who conducted that interrogation. And when we feed them suggestive information that insinuates it's a different person, many of them misidentify their interrogator, often identifying someone who doesn't even remotely resemble the real interrogator. And so what these studies are showing is that when you feed people misinformation about some experience that they may have had, you can distort or contaminate or change their memory. Well, out there in the real world, misinformation is everywhere. We get misinformation not only if we're questioned in a leading way, but if we talk to other witnesses who might consciously or inadvertently feed us some erroneous information, or if we see media coverage about some event we might have experienced. All of these provide the opportunity for this kind of contamination of our memory. In the 1990s, we began to see an even more extreme kind of memory problem. Some patients were going into therapy with one problem, maybe they had depression, eating disorder, and they were coming out of therapy with a different problem. Extreme memories for horrific brutalization, sometimes in satanic rituals, sometimes involving really bizarre and unusual elements. One woman came out of psychotherapy believing that she'd endured years of ritualistic abuse, where she was forced into a pregnancy and that the baby was cut from her belly. But there were no physical scars or any kind of physical evidence that could have supported her story. And when I began looking into these cases, I was wondering, where do these bizarre memories come from? And what I found is that most of these situations involved some particular form of psychotherapy. And so I asked, were some of the things going on in this psychotherapy, like the imagination exercises, or dream interpretation, or in some cases hypnosis, or in some cases exposure to false information, were these leading these patients to develop these very bizarre, unlikely memories? And I designed some experiments to try to study the processes that were being used in this psychotherapy so I could study the development of these very rich false memories. In one of the first studies we did, we used suggestion, a method inspired by the psychotherapy we saw in these cases. We used this kind of suggestion and planted a false memory that when you were a kid, 5 or 6 years old, you were lost in a shopping mall. You were frightened, you were crying, you were ultimately rescued by an elderly person and reunited with the family. And we succeeded in planting this memory in the minds of about 1/4 of our subjects. And you might be thinking, well, that's not particularly stressful. But we and other investigators have planted rich false memories of things that were much more unusual and much more stressful. So in a study done in Tennessee, researchers planted the false memory that when you were a kid, you nearly drowned and had to be rescued by a lifeguard. And in a study done in Canada, researchers planted the false memory that when you were a kid, something as awful as being attacked by a vicious animal happened to you, succeeding with about half of their subjects. And in a study done in Italy, researchers planted the false memory when you were a kid, you witnessed demonic possession. I do want to add that it might seem like we are traumatizing these experimental subjects in the name of science, but our studies have gone through thorough evaluation by research ethics boards that have made the decision that the temporary discomfort that some of these subjects might experience in these studies is outweighed by the importance of this problem for understanding memory processes and the abuse of memory that is going on in some places in the world. Well, to my surprise, when I published this work and began to speak out against this particular brand of psychotherapy, it created some pretty bad problems for me. Hostilities primarily from the repressed memory therapists who felt under attack and by the patients whom they had influenced. I had sometimes armed guards and speeches that I was invited to give, people trying to drum up letter writing campaigns to get me fired. But probably the worst was I suspected that a woman was innocent of abuse that was being claimed by her grown daughter. She accused her mother of sexual abuse based on a repressed memory. And this accusing daughter had actually allowed her story to be filmed and presented in public places. I was suspicious of this story, and so I started to investigate and eventually found information that convinced me that this mother was innocent. I published an expose on the case, and a little while later, the accusing daughter filed a lawsuit. Even though I'd never mentioned her name, she sued me for defamation and invasion of privacy. And I went through nearly 5 years of dealing with this messy, unpleasant litigation. But finally, it was over, and I could really get back to my work. In the process, however, I became part of a disturbing trend in America where scientists are being sued for simply speaking out on matters of great public controversy. When I got back to my work, I asked this question: if I plant a false memory in your mind, does it have repercussions? Does it affect your later thoughts, your later behaviors? Our first study planted a false memory that you got sick as a child, eating certain foods, hard-boiled eggs, dill pickles, strawberry ice cream, and we found that once we planted this false memory, people didn't want to eat the foods as much at an outdoor picnic. The false memories aren't necessarily bad or unpleasant. If we planted a warm, fuzzy memory involving a healthy food like asparagus, we could get people to want to eat asparagus more. And so what these studies are showing is that you can plant false memories and they have repercussions that affect behavior long after the memories take hold. Well, along with this ability to plant memories and control behavior, obviously comes some important ethical issues. Like, when should we use this mind technology, and should we ever ban its use? Therapists can't ethically plant false memories in the mind of their patients, even if it would help the patient. But there's nothing to stop a parent from trying this out on their overweight or obese teenager. And when I suggested this publicly, it created outcry again. There she goes. She's advocating that parents lie to their children. Hello, Santa Claus. I mean, another way another way to think about this is, which would you rather have? A kid with obesity, diabetes, shortened lifespan, all the things that go with it, or a kid with one little extra bit of false memory? I know what I would choose for a kid of mine. But maybe my work has made me different from most people. Most people cherish their memories, know that they represent their identity, who they are, where they came from. And I appreciate that. I feel that way too. But I know from my work how much fiction is already in there. If I've learned anything from these decades of working on these problems, it's this: just because somebody tells you something and they say it with confidence, just because they say it with lots of detail, just because they express emotion when they say it, it doesn't mean that it really happened. We can't reliably distinguish true memories from false memories. We need independent corroboration. Such a discovery has made me more tolerant of the everyday memory mistakes that my friends and family members make. Such a discovery might have saved Steve Titus, the man whose whole future was snatched away by a false memory. But meanwhile, we should all keep in mind, we do well to, that memory, like liberty, is a fragile thing. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I know that was a little long. Thank you for bearing with me, but I love this TED Talk. I think that it raises some really, really fascinating points from not only a scientific perspective, but an ethical perspective as well. And so I encourage you to think about what she said about, is it ethical to implant false memories in children if it is beneficial for their health? At what point is it too far, and are we doing a disservice? She also raised some really interesting points about ethics. And remember, we talked back in week 2 about how we should not do harm to participants. And I really like that she addressed the point about how the review board deemed that their work really did more good than harm overall. And she sort of addressed that risk-benefit ratio. So I'm happy to talk more about this with anybody who is more interested. But for now, let's move on. So what kind of role do false memories play in the real world? Most of the time, it's fairly routine, low impact scenarios where maybe you remember something a little wrong and, all right, no big deal. You thought that someone was wearing a blue shirt, they're wearing a green shirt, whatever. But there are some high stakes scenarios, such as eyewitness testimony, which Dr. Loftus talked about in the beginning of her talk. The correlation between eyewitness confidence in their testimony and their accuracy in their testimony is fairly weak. In fact, 3/4 or more prisoners who were acquitted by DNA testing were in jail in the first place because they were mistakenly identified by eyewitnesses. So let that sink in for a moment. That's kind of huge. Eyewitness testimony is one of the main ways that perpetrators are identified in the court system. So are we putting people in prison based on really an inefficient system of verification? You know, that's pretty huge. Eyewitness testimony can provide valuable evidence, but this is critical on their ability to have the conditions be right. So they have to have had ample time to observe the perpetrator, good lighting conditions, the person can't be disguised in any way, they can't be wearing sunglasses or a hat or a bulky sweater or anything. And only if there's a very short amount of time that's elapsed between the alleged crime and the testimony. Eyewitnesses are much less likely to be accurate under other conditions, such as when the alleged perpetrator is of a different race than they are, when the witness has talked to other witnesses, when the crime was viewed under stressful circumstances, and when they feel threatened. So if you witness a car accident from a little ways away, it's certainly scary. It's going to get your heart beating fast, but you're not in any immediate danger. Versus if you witness an armed robbery where you're in the same space as somebody holding a gun. Psychologists can play a critical role in the quality of eyewitness testimony. They can educate jurors about the science of eyewitness recall and can inform the justice system on the best way to perform eyewitness lineups. There's also differences in the type of lineups. Simultaneous lineups that view one person at a time are different from sequential lineups, which view people in a group. Lab evidence suggests that identifying suspects is more accurate in a sequential lineup compared to a simultaneous one. And we also learned that from Loftus's work that the way questions are phrased can influence responding. So remember the smashed versus hit versus bumped scenario. So what I hope you'll take away from this whole week's lecture, but particularly this segment, is that memories are not reliable all the time. And so we have to be very careful about leaning too heavily on them because we can be fooled. The code for this week's quiz is material. That's all for this lecture. Up next in our final chat, we will talk about some strategies, ways that you can enhance your memories, which will hopefully help you on exams, not just for this class, but in all your classes.